Welcome to True Crime Kin channel, where we dive into real stories that shake the core of human relationships. Today's case is one of shocking betrayal, twisted emotions, and a tragic ending that no one saw coming. So let's begin. Matthew Thompson was a successful businessman, a loving husband to his wife, Laura, and a doting father to his only son, Jason. Life had been good for the Thompsons, but beneath the surface of their seemingly perfect family lay cracks that were starting to show. Jason, now 22, was in a serious relationship with his girlfriend, Ava. They had been together for over a year, and she had become a regular fixture in the Thompson household. Ava was charming, intelligent, and beautiful. A young woman who seemed to have it all, but her magnetic presence had caught the attention of more than just Jason. Matthew, who was nearing his 50th birthday, found himself inexplicably drawn to Ava. At first, it was just an innocent attraction, something he dismissed as a fleeting thought. But over time, his fascination grew into something darker. He knew it was wrong, but the thrill of the forbidden made it impossible to resist. It started innocently enough: longer conversations, lingering glances, subtle touches. Ava, who had grown bored with Jason's predictability, found Matthew's mature confidence intriguing. Before long, what began as harmless flirtation turned into a full-blown affair. They thought they could keep their secret hidden, but secrets have a way of surfacing at the worst possible moments. Jason was no fool. He began to notice the small things first: the way Ava's gaze lingered a bit too long on his father, the mysterious late-night text she tried to hide, and the way his father seemed unusually attentive whenever she was around. Jason's gut told him that something was wrong, but he couldn't bring himself to confront either of them directly. Not yet. As Jason's suspicions grew, so did his distance from Ava. Their once strong relationship began to crack, and Ava, frustrated by Jason's aloofness, turned to Matthew more frequently for comfort. The affair intensified, and the thrill of their secret meetings only made them more reckless. Matthew, too, started to let his guard down. He was careful at first, meeting Ava in secluded locations, keeping their communications discreet. But as his desire grew, so did his arrogance. He convinced himself that no one would ever find out that he could have his cake and eat it too. Meanwhile, Laura remained blissfully unaware of the storm brewing right under her nose. She was busy with her own life. Focusing on her career and maintaining the household, she trusted her husband and believed that their marriage was as strong as ever. But Jason couldn't ignore the signs. He started to do his own digging, secretly checking Ava's phone when she wasn't looking, paying closer attention to his father's movements. And then one day he found the proof he needed: a series of incriminating messages between Matthew and Ava, messages that confirmed his worst fears. Jason's world came crashing down in an instant. The betrayal cut deeper than anything he had ever experienced, but instead of confronting them immediately, Jason decided to play the long game. Revenge, he thought, would be much sweeter if it was slow and calculated. Jason kept his discovery a secret, biding his time while pretending that everything was normal. He knew that if he acted impulsively, his plan for revenge would fall apart. So he watched, waited, and seethed with anger as Matthew and Ava continued their illicit affair. The longer Jason waited, the more twisted his thoughts became. It wasn't just about the affair anymore. It was about making them pay for what they had done to him. He envisioned a future where both Matthew and Ava suffered in ways they couldn't imagine, where they would regret ever crossing him. Meanwhile, Matthew and Ava's relationship grew more reckless. They met more frequently, taking greater risks with each encounter. Ava, who had initially been driven by the thrill of the affair, began to feel a sense of guilt creeping in. She knew that what they were doing was wrong, but she couldn't stop herself. Matthew's attention was intoxicating, and she had become addicted to the power she felt in their secret relationship. But as their passion deepened, so did the tension in the Thompson household. Jason's cold demeanor didn't go unnoticed by Laura, who had started to sense that something was off. She questioned Jason about his mood, but he brushed it off, telling her that he was just stressed about school and work. Laura, trusting her son, didn't press the issue further. However, the facade couldn't last forever. The longer Jason waited, the more his anger festered, and soon the cracks in his plan began to show. One night, after months of waiting, Jason finally snapped. He couldn't keep up the charade any longer. He decided it was time to confront both Matthew and Ava. to lay everything out in the open and let them know that he was on to them. He chose his moment carefully, a family dinner where both Matthew and Ava would be present. The tension was palpable from the start, with Jason barely able to keep his emotions in check. As the meal progressed, he could feel his anger rising like a pot about to boil over. Finally, he couldn't take it anymore. Jason stood up, his voice cold and steady, and accused Matthew and Ava of betraying him. He revealed the messages he had found, exposing their affair in front of Laura, who sat frozen in shock and disbelief. The room fell silent as the weight of Jason's words sank in. Matthew tried to deny it at first, but the evidence was undeniable. Ava, too, was caught off guard, stammering in an attempt to explain herself, but there was nothing left to say. Their secret was out. Laura, devastated by the revelation, broke down in tears. Her perfect family had been shattered in an instant, and she couldn't comprehend how her husband and her son's girlfriend could have done something so cruel. Jason, however, wasn't interested in apologies or explanations. He made it clear that this wasn't over, not by a long shot. He had no intention of forgiving them, and he would make sure they paid for their betrayal in the most painful way possible. After the confrontation, the Thompson household became a battleground. Laura couldn't bear to look at Matthew and filed for divorce almost immediately. She moved out of the house, leaving Jason alone with his father. The once loving relationship between father and son had now turned into a tense standoff, with neither of them willing to back down. Ava tried to make amends with Jason, but he refused to have anything to do with her. She was consumed with guilt and regret, but she couldn't escape the mess she had helped create. Her relationship with Matthew became strained as well, and the passion that had once driven their affair began to fade in the harsh light of reality. But Jason wasn't done. The confrontation had been just the beginning. Now he was ready to put his real plan into action. He started to manipulate both Matthew and Ava, playing them against each other and planting seeds of doubt in their minds. He would leave cryptic messages for Matthew, making him believe that someone was watching him, someone who knew all his secrets. He would drop hints to Ava that Matthew had grown tired of her, that he was ready to move on to someone new. Slowly but surely, Jason began to unravel their lives from the inside. Matthew became increasingly paranoid, convinced that someone was out to get him. He started to drink more, to lose focus at work, and to snap at anyone who questioned him. Ava, too, became consumed by fear, constantly looking over her shoulder and wondering when the other shoe would drop. Jason watched it all unfold with a twisted sense of satisfaction. He was in control now, and he relished every moment of their suffering. As Jason's psychological torment took its toll on Matthew and Ava, tensions continued to rise. But Jason wanted more than just emotional suffering. He wanted blood. He wanted them to feel the same physical pain that he had felt emotionally. One night, Jason took his revenge to the next level. He carefully plotted out his attack, ensuring that it would be brutal, but leave no evidence pointing back to him. He waited until Matthew was alone, drunk and vulnerable, and then struck. Jason attacked his father with a crowbar in their garage, hitting him repeatedly until Matthew lay unconscious and bloodied on the ground. But Jason wasn't finished. Instead of killing Matthew outright, he left him there, barely alive, as a message. He wanted his father to know that this was just the beginning, that the worst was yet to come. Matthew was found by a neighbor the next morning, barely clinging to life. He was rushed to the hospital, where he slipped into a coma. The police launched an investigation, but there were no leads, no fingerprints, no witnesses, nothing that could tie the attack to Jason. Ava, terrified by what had happened, went into hiding. She knew that Jason was behind the attack, even if she couldn't prove it. She tried to disappear, hoping that distance would keep her safe. But Jason wasn't about to let her get away that easily. With Matthew in a coma and Ava on the run, Jason's thirst for revenge only grew stronger. He wasn't satisfied with leaving Matthew to die slowly in a hospital bed. He wanted to finish what he had started. And as for Ava, Jason was determined to find her and make her pay for her part in the betrayal. Jason began tracking Ava, using every resource at his disposal to locate her. He hacked into her social media accounts, checked her bank statements, and monitored her phone records. He was methodical and relentless, refusing to give up until he found her. Ava tried to stay off the grid, but she couldn't hide forever. She was always looking over her shoulder, living in fear that Jason would catch up to her. It wasn't long before Jason found a lead, a small town several hours away where Ava had been using a fake name and working at a local diner. Jason smiled to himself, knowing that it was only a matter of time before he would finally have her in his grasp. He packed a bag, made sure his alibi was airtight, and set out on the road. His mind was consumed by thoughts of revenge, playing out every scenario of how he would make Ava suffer. She had taken everything from him, his trust, his family, his sense of security, and now it was her turn to lose everything. When Jason arrived in the town, he scouted the diner from a distance, waiting for the right moment to strike. He watched as Ava went about her day. Unaware that her worst nightmare was just around the corner, the anticipation fueled Jason's rage, and he could barely contain himself as he waited for nightfall. That evening, after the diner had closed and the streets were quiet, Jason made his move. He followed Ava home, keeping a safe distance so she wouldn't notice him. When she finally reached her small, run-down apartment, Jason slipped inside just before she locked the door behind her. Ava turned around and froze when she saw Jason standing in the shadows of her living room. Her heart raced and she instinctively reached for her phone. But Jason was quicker. He grabbed her arm, yanking the phone from her grasp and smashing it to the ground. "Did you really think you could run from me, Ava?" Jason's voice was low, filled with venom. "Did you really think I wouldn't find you?" Ava was trembling, tears welling up in her eyes as she tried to plead with him. "Jason, please. I'm sorry. I never meant for any of this to happen. Please let me go." But Jason wasn't interested in. He had heard enough lies, and now it was time for retribution. "You destroyed my family. You betrayed me, and now you're going to pay for it." Ava tried to fight back, but Jason was too strong. He overpowered her, forcing her to the ground as he tied her hands behind her back. The fear in her eyes only fueled Jason's rage, and he reveled in the power he held over her. 4 hours, Jason tormented Ava, both physically and psychologically. He made her relive every moment of their affair, every betrayal until she was broken and sobbing on the floor. But even that wasn't enough to satisfy Jason's thirst for revenge. As Jason continued his assault on Ava, something inside him began to shift. The high he had felt from exacting his revenge started to wear off, replaced by an overwhelming sense of emptiness. He had spent so much time consumed by anger and hatred that he hadn't stopped to consider what would come after, looking down at Ava, beaten and broken. Jason felt a pang of guilt for the first time. He had crossed a line, become someone he no longer recognized, but it was too late to turn back now. Too much had been done, and there was no one doing it. Jason left Ava in her apartment, barely alive, just as he had done with his father. He didn't kill her outright, but he knew that the damage he had inflicted would haunt her for the rest of her life if she even survived as Jason walked away from the scene. He realized that revenge hadn't brought him the satisfaction he had hoped for. Instead, it had left him hollow with nothing but the wreckage of his own life to deal with. News of Matthew's coma had spread, and the police were still investigating the attack. Jason had been careful to cover his tracks, but the pressure was mounting. He was starting to unravel, plagued by nightmares and paranoia. He couldn't shake the feeling that the walls were closing in on him. Meanwhile, Ava had been found by a neighbor and rushed to the hospital. She was barely conscious, but alive. When she awoke, she was terrified to speak about what had happened, fearing that Jason would come after her again. But the police pushed for answers, and eventually Ava broke down and told them everything. Jason, now a prime suspect in both the attack on his father and the assault on Ava, knew that it was only a matter of time before the police caught up to him. He tried to stay one step ahead, but his mind was unraveling faster than he could control. The guilt, the fear, the weight of his actions. It all became too much for him to bear. In a final, desperate act, Jason decided to end it all. He couldn't face the consequences of what he had done, couldn't live with the guilt that was eating him alive. He left a note for his mother, apologizing for everything, and drove to the same bridge where he had often gone as a child with his father. Standing at the edge, Jason looked down at the rushing water below. The noise of the river drowned out the chaos in his mind, offering a moment of peace that he hadn't felt in months. He took a deep breath, closed his eyes, and stepped forward. But before he could fall, a hand grabbed his arm, pulling him back to safety. It was Detective Sarah Blake, who had been following Jason for days, suspecting that he might try something drastic. "Jason, it's over," she said softly, trying to calm him down. "You don't have to do this. We can help you." Jason collapsed to the ground, sobbing uncontrollably. The weight of everything he had done came crashing down on him, and for the first time he allowed himself to feel the full extent of his pain. He had lost everything, his family, his future, his sanity, and now all that was left was to face the consequences. Jason was arrested and charged with the attacks on both Matthew and Ava. The trial was a media spectacle with every detail of the Thompson family's tragedy laid bare for the world to see. Jason's once promising future was gone, replaced by a lifetime of regret in imprisonment. Matthew, who had awoken from his coma but was left permanently disabled, couldn't bring himself to visit his son in prison. The shame and guilt he felt for his part in the destruction of their family were too much to bear. He spent his days in a rehabilitation center, a shadow of the man he once was. Ava, too, was left scarred by the ordeal. Both physically and emotionally, she tried to rebuild her life, but the trauma of what had happened haunted her every day. She moved far away from the town where it all began, hoping to find some semblance of peace. Laura, devastated by the loss of her family, withdrew from the world. She couldn't understand how everything had gone so wrong, how the people she loved most had been capable of such betrayal and violence. She lived in quiet isolation, trying to piece together the fragments of her shattered life. In the end, there were no winners in the Thompson family's tragedy, only broken lives and a lingering sense of loss that would never fully heal. The story of the Thompson family serves as a chilling reminder of how easily love can turn to betrayal and how betrayal can spiral into destruction. What began as an illicit affair between a husband and his son's girlfriend ended in violence, madness, and the complete disintegration of a family. Jason's desire for revenge consumed him, turning him into the very monster he sought to punish. In the end, his quest for justice brought nothing but more pain and suffering, leaving him with nothing but regret and a lifetime behind bars. The lesson is clear. In the pursuit of revenge, there are no victors, only casualties. The aftermath of Jason's arrest had left everyone involved reeling with his life spiraling out of control. He became more determined than ever to make those who had wronged him suffer, even from behind bars. He began to make threats and demands through his lawyer, trying to manipulate and intimidate Matthew and Ava into further suffering. Matthew, recovering from his injuries and now living in a permanent state of disability, had been thrust into the public eye. The media loved to cover his fall from grace, and he became a symbol of the dark consequences of infidelity. While he was confined to a wheelchair, his mental state was deteriorating rapidly, haunted by guilt in the fear of Jason's threats. Ava, trying to rebuild her life, had taken on a new identity and moved to a remote location. However, she could never completely escape the shadow of her past. The constant fear of Jason finding her was a heavy burden, and she lived in isolation, never feeling safe. Her nightmares of the ordeal she had been through were compounded by Jason's relentless threats. One night, Jason's rage reached a boiling point. He had learned from his sources about Ava's new location and Matthew's deteriorating mental state. He decided to strike one final, devastating blow to complete his revenge. Using his contacts in the underworld, he orchestrated a plan to murder both Matthew and Ava, making sure that they would never find peace or solace. For Matthew, Jason arranged a brutal scheme. He had someone on the inside of the rehabilitation center slip a powerful sedative into Matthew's medication. When Matthew was deeply unconscious, Jason's accomplice, disguised as a nurse, slipped into his room and strangled him with a pillow. The act was swift and silent, leaving Matthew's lifeless body behind. His death was made to look like a tragic complication of his injuries, ensuring that it would initially be classified as a medical accident. Meanwhile, Jason tracked Ava to her secluded home. Under the cover of the night, he broke into her house with grim determination. Ava was asleep in her bed, unaware of the approaching danger. Jason entered her bedroom silently and stood over her for a moment, savoring the finality of what he was about to do. When Ava awoke and saw Jason standing there, her scream was cut short by a brutal knife attack. Jason slashed her throat and continued his assault until Ava lay dead in her bed. The scene was gruesome, a stark contrast to the quiet, lonely life Ava had tried to escape to. With both Matthew and Ava dead, Jason felt a twisted sense of satisfaction. He had achieved his revenge, but at a tremendous cost. He had crossed the line from vengeful son to a murderer, his soul tainted by the bloodshed. The murders of Matthew and Ava sent shock waves through the community and the media. The once private scandal had escalated into a full-blown tragedy. With even more bloodshed, as details of the murders emerged, the public was horrified and the case became a grim spectacle. Jason, now a prime suspect in both murders, was under heavy surveillance. He had been thoroughly investigated for any involvement in the deaths of Matthew and Ava, and the evidence against him was mounting. His desperate attempts to manipulate and threaten his way to revenge had only made things worse. The police had already begun to connect the dots. Linking the recent murders to Jason's known threats and his history of violence in prison, Jason's behavior grew increasingly erratic. His previously calculated demeanor gave way to bouts of paranoia and rage. He became convinced that everyone was out to get him, and his mental state deteriorated rapidly. He would rant about how he had been betrayed by everyone in his life, how he had been wronged, and how he was a victim of a larger conspiracy. His pleas for help fell on deaf ears as his isolation and guilt took their toll. Laura, now living in a small, quiet town far from the chaos of her former life, was still grappling with the aftermath of her family's destruction. She had lost her husband, her son, and her daughter-in-law, all in a series of devastating events that had shattered her world. She struggled to find any semblance of normalcy, but found it difficult to escape the shadow of the tragedy that had consumed her family. Jason's trial was a grim spectacle, with the prosecution painting him as a cold-blooded killer who had let his revenge consume him. The courtroom was filled with evidence of his involvement in the murders, and the emotional testimony from Ava's family and friends only added to the sense of horror surrounding the case. Jason's defense attempted to argue that he had been driven to madness by the betrayal in the subsequent events. But the jury was not swayed. Jason was found guilty of all charges, and the judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. His final days in court were marked by a sense of resignation. The weight of his actions had finally sunk in, and he faced the reality of spending the rest of his life behind bars, alone and consumed by the very darkness he had unleashed. As the media coverage of the trial faded, the story of the Thompson family became a cautionary tale. A stark reminder of how betrayal, revenge, and unchecked rage could lead to ultimate destruction. Laura continued to live in her quiet town, trying to rebuild her life amidst the ruins of her past, while Jason faced the consequences of his actions, forever imprisoned by his own choices. The story of the Thompsons ended in tragedy, a somber testament to the destructive power of betrayal and the futility of revenge. Thanks for watching. Subscribe and like this video for more true crime video. Don't forget to leave your thoughts and theories in the comments section below. Take care and see you in the next video.